All right, let's kick this off. Very, very excited to call to the stage Professor Stavros Gadinis, who will introduce our next panelists for our discussion on disclosures, both voluntary and involuntary. Please join us on stage. Before they get started, a couple of logistical announcements. Those joining us online, if you are interested in joining tomorrow's discussion virtually, there is a link on our website. Please access that and register. And then quick reminder to all folks, I said just a bit earlier, but there are seats up here in the front. It's half a table completely empty. We'd love for you to grab those seats. So without further ado, please put your hands together for our next panel.
Great, thank you very much. So from the beginning today, we heard about regulatory fragmentation, multipolarity, a lot of new regulations coming in. So this is the panel about disclosure and regulation. So I think you will agree that this is kind of one of the burning questions of the day. I'd like to, I introduce myself. I'm Stavros Gadinis. I'm a professor at Berkeley Law. I've been a corporate law professor since 2010. And it's great that now we get to talk about climate governance in corporate law. I'm very excited about it. I will start by asking everyone on the panel to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their connection to the topic.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Lynn. I am a partner at Goodwin Procter, and I represent public companies and their disclosure obligations, principally that derive from the regulations of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I spent about a decade of my career at the SEC in the Division of Corporation Finance, where I interpreted the SEC's rules around public companies and helped write some of those rules. So I look at the topics we're going to talk about from that perspective.
Hi, everyone. Emily Holland, ESG and Sustainability Counsel at Simpson Thacher. I counsel a broad range of multinationals and financial institutions on the mounting pressure for transparency with respect to their social and environmental footprint. That takes a range of forms these days, everything from ESG and impact investing to sustainable finance, debt offerings, credit facilities, securities offerings, M&A due diligence, broad range of corporate governance, disclosure reporting, and programmatic uplift, regulatory scoping, et cetera. I also teach at Georgetown Law School, the Business and Human Rights Practicum. Great to be here.
Hi, I'm Ilmi Granoff. I run a small decarbonization advisory firm called Climate Technology Group for part of the week, and I'm a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School for another part of the week, and a non-executive director of the Carbon Tracker Initiative for weekends and nights. And I am involved in this work, really became involved in this work by creating and running the ClimateWorks Foundation's finance program, where I worked on both voluntary and regulatory approaches to integrating climate risk and considerations of climate into the capital markets and the financial system. So I've thought about this a bunch from a voluntary and mandatory perspective. I'm also a retired lawyer and had the pleasure of practicing law with Tim Wilkins, who was on the prior panel many years ago, the nicest partner in the practice in the firm that I was at, widely known as that.
So I apologize. I was just having the pleasure of testifying before the Little Hoover Commission, which I'm sure many of you from California are familiar with. It's a fact-finding and investigative body, and guess what they wanted to talk about? The impact of climate change on the insurance market. So I'm sorry I'm a little bit delayed, but Dave Jones, I direct the Climate Risk Initiative at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. I had the privilege of serving as California's insurance commissioner for 8 years, and our center's climate risk initiative made an important set of recommendations thanks to some foundational funding from the ClimateWorks Foundation, which at that time their sustainable finance program was being led by Ilmi. And one of our seminal recommendations back in 2020 was that California ought to adopt a requirement that corporations not only disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, but also engage in corporate reporting with regard to their climate risks using the TCFD framework. And so, short version of the story is we wrote the bill that later on became SB 261, which is one of the bills that's subject of this panel. One of the two seminal California laws that were enacted that require corporations to engage in disclosure not only of their greenhouse gas emissions, but the risks they face as companies. So I'll stop there because I missed the introduction. I'm not sure what we're doing at this point.
We're introducing ourselves.
Sorry. You give me a mic and I go.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. It's clear that we have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. So let's start with the SEC proposal. It was announced earlier this month. People were not clear whether it will be formalized or not after 2 years of going back and forth. But now, here we have it. As it was mentioned before, it received a record of commentary, and perhaps as a result of this commentary, perhaps as a result of pressure, we saw that the final proposal had a lot of significant changes compared to the initial rule, which is actually very rare. The SEC very rarely changes its proposals, but here they did, and some of the most controversial aspects were removed. So now Scope 3 emissions are no longer included in mandatory disclosure. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are going to be disclosed only if regarded material for the corporation. So I wanted to start with asking you all, now that we have the SEC final rule, what do you make of it? Does it fall in line with market expectations, with investor expectations? How do you see it impacting the kinds of disclosures that companies are going to be making going forward?
Well, I think it proves the point that you can't please all of the people all the time. And that really is what the upshot of what ultimately happened with the SEC's adoption of the final rules, in that they received a lot of comment. The comment went in all different directions, and they tried to resolve those comments by making the changes that we just talked about. And those changes will make the rule, the disclosure that's then required by those rules, not as easily comparable to disclosures that other companies subject to similar or additional requirements. The comparability will be very difficult, I think, as a result. And so the way I really see it is the SEC disclosure, if it will ultimately be required, will be just a very sort of small subset of the mosaic of disclosures that people make regarding climate disclosures, whether that be in accordance with state requirements, whether that be in accordance with the European Union requirements, whether that be in accordance with just expectations of investors and overall voluntary reporting. So I think what we will just have is very much the SEC disclosures as just a fragment of the types of disclosures that the market expects companies to make.
Go ahead, Emily. I wanted to ask you next.
Fragments, a word you never want to hear in this context. And I couldn't agree more completely with that statement. Yeah, I agree. It's evident that there are mixed reactions and also legal actions on both sides. I think I'll sort of zero in on the, did this meet or align with expectations, right? And I think the answer there is yes and no. The SEC under this administration has adopted a strategy, I think, fair to say, of proposing what can often be very broad and sweeping rules that in the final reckoning are often scaled back, sometimes significantly, right? We've seen that before. As you noted, unprecedented level of comments received, 24,000 from issuers, shareholders, interest groups, et cetera. And Chair Gensler was, quite clear from the outset that he would try in the final rule to take account of those comments and forge a rule that could withstand legal actions that would follow, and they have followed. I think until the bitter end, there was real question as to the controversial aspects, and a lot of uncertainty with respect to different pathways, that would follow. Scope 3 being the most obvious, right? There was some question as to whether it would be scrapped entirely, as it has been, nothing there, not even in the future, or whether there would be some, accounting for companies that are in scope of requirements elsewhere that have a Scope 3 component, and how to, how to manage that. On Scope 1 and 2, there was some sense a materiality qualifier would be applied, but not the, scale back as to scope and, timing and flexibility, that's there. The financial statement footnotes, right? The very controversial 1% line item threshold, that was significantly scaled back. I think there was expectation that that would happen, but not, to the degree it was. But I guess I'd conclude by saying the immediate reaction focused on the dial back. Very important to remember that this is an extremely significant environmental sustainability reporting requirement, and the first, at the federal level in the United States. I don't personally believe it will catalyze the normative shift that the EU rules that are pushing us toward greater transparency, disclosure, and accountability with respect to longer-term business issues relating to environment, climate, and people are doing. Those rules focus on companies as well as the entities that invest and finance in them, and are, bringing us into a new place, as we'll get to later. But ultimately, here we are, and on to you.
Sure. So I'll keep this broad question relatively brief answer. So very big picture. It's not that long ago that the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure came out, an industry-led group kind of establishing a set of norms on what types of financial information are relevant to, what climate-related information is relevant to financial decision-making. And if you look at the gestalt of the rule, it largely tracks the set of principles and types of disclosures in that. And it is important to take a big picture view and say, yes, this is a normative shift. It is not a huge normative shift 2017 to 2024. It's a big normative shift from like 2010 to 2024. And so in that we went relatively rapidly from no real norms at all, some sort of like doing good is also good for the bottom line, voluntary CSR type stuff, to a set of climate related financial information principles that were entirely market led, to a rule. That's quite big. In the shorter term, we got really caught up in some of the storm about what information is important and not. And I think actually the SEC's final rule in some of the details is great, and some of the details is a bit confused, because it covers ground that, or maybe neglects ground that is very clearly financially material and in the draft rule, and really targets the relationship between non-financial information and financial information. And then other places where it's somewhat more expansive. But the bigger picture is that it just enshrines in a regulatory framework a set of principles that have been articulated by investors. And if I can complain, just one complaint here on this, which is just, I think it's dangerous for agencies to sort of pre-chill their decision making rather than focusing on what they believe, in the case of the SEC, what creates efficient capital formation and protects the public interest, and is useful to the reasonable investor, rather than trying to read the room, including courts that are highly politicized. Because if you're going to get litigated either way, you might as well put out what you think is in the best interests of your mandate. And I think there's a little bit of prevarication that is in there that reflects sort of anticipating that and self-chilling. And I think it's just really dangerous for agencies to do that in general. And I hope that it is a attempt to a base run rather than a home run, but with further elaboration, which we can get into later, that the SEC can do to clarify some of the places where it may be skipped over in the rule.
I agree with all that. I think that the challenge for registrants is going to be, though, that to the extent that they have a branch or subsidiary in Europe and they have substantial net turnover there, and there's a threshold under the EU's CSRD, they're going to have to report under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, which is importantly far more exacting and comprehensive and includes the notion of double materiality. So it's not just whether the climate risk is material to you, but what are you doing that might be material to the broader economy, which probably is going to mean that they're going to have to do Scope 3 reporting under that European regime. And then you have the California laws, which we may talk about in a little more detail, but the SB 253, which is the greenhouse gas emissions reporting requirement that California has enacted, which lands on both public and private companies, but which is going to pick up a substantial number of the largest public companies in America. There's no materiality condition to reporting Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So you're going to have corporates and financial institutions that are going to be whipsawed between these various reporting regimes, which the SEC could have avoided if they had stuck with their initial proposed rule. And I agree with the comments I made previously, and the point Ilmi made, which is, if they thought they were going to avoid litigation, guess what? But they may have ended up in generating more litigation against corporates and financial institutions because of this materiality condition, and because there's going to be a lot of dispute over whether the company made the right call with regard to something as material or not material.
Great. So I'm going to get to the California laws in a little bit because I really want your take on that, Dave. But I wanted to stick with the SEC proposal for the SEC rule. I've been so used to calling it the SEC proposal that now I have to get used to the fact that it's a rule. So I want to stick with it a little longer. And I wanted to ask Emily and Dave. So one of the main criticism against the SEC rule has been that it's going to cause an increase in compliance costs for companies. And that's been kind of a theme in the comment letters that the SEC received, which is kind of interesting to think about, given that we're talking, as Ilmi pointed out, about a regime that closely tracks voluntary efforts by companies that were already in place. So I was wondering, so clearly there are some companies that were already complying and some companies that were behind. And I wanted to ask you about those compliance costs. What do you think they are? Are they higher or lower given where we ended up with the final rule? And what do you think of that criticism more generally?
Well, I think having spent some time at the SEC writing rules, the thing that, in terms of coming up with the cost estimates is extremely difficult. And I can remember back in the days before armies of economists worked at the SEC, the few economists that did would come to me and say, well, how much do you think this costs? And I would say, well, I thought that was your job. And then I would say, it's probably about $10,000 or something like that. And then they would go off and try to come up with some sort of justification. Things have changed a lot in the years since that, but I think if you look at the costs and the estimates of costs included in the cost-benefit analysis in the rule, you have to laugh because those costs seem ridiculously low for any company, really, even companies that already have made efforts to voluntarily report their greenhouse gas emissions and report under the TCFD framework. So I think cost really will be disproportionately borne by the smaller companies, and the SEC tried to make accommodations for them in terms of the time frame with which they will have to report and the types of information they will have to report. But I think in my own experience, smaller companies have been less likely to have provided a full panoply of voluntary disclosures under TCFD and greenhouse gas emission protocol, which is what the SEC looked to for their framework. So I think there will be a lot of costs for the larger issuers in terms of implementing the internal controls or financial reporting and the disclosure controls that they will now have to do by migrating this information into the SEC's format. And so there will be incremental costs for them, certainly. And then for the smaller issuers, there will just be a prolonged period of cost trying to create the systems sort of de novo to report this information if they haven't done so already?
I guess my perspective is some of this discussion is a bit of a red herring to the extent that many companies that will be in scope of this rule have already been reporting this for some time. I think latest stats I saw were 20,000 companies reporting to CDP. By the way, half of them report on their scope 3 emissions. I think it was 14, maybe 1950 companies with validated science-based emissions targets, which of course includes scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions. The voluntary aspect here is an interesting, pathway we might go down, right? For many companies, to what extent might they go beyond the rule as we now have it? That'll depend a lot on historical practice, stakeholder preferences, expectations that have been set, other legislative and non-legislative, drivers of activity, perceived risks and liabilities attached with additional reporting. But on the cost item specifically, I thought it was fascinating that a quarter of the 240-page release for this rule focused on cost-benefit analysis. I think the SEC's own estimate was, at least at the starting gate, it would be in the range of $197,000 to $793,000. And then another, stakeholder, reported their own, evaluation that it might amount to about 15% of a company's total SEC disclosure costs annually. Remains to be seen. Difficult to disaggregate, based on historical practices and other regimes that will have an impact here. But I ultimately defer to my colleagues' expertise.
So we covered what's out of the proposal. I wanted to go to what's in the proposal. And that was something that came out in that conversation. I think Elmi brought it up earlier. So one of the elements that I find kind of very interesting is that the requirement that companies have to disclose how they think climate change is going to affect their business in material ways. So this is kind of a broad, open-ended invite to companies to assess climate change materially for them. Now, this is kind of flexible and broad and kind of vague, and I think that's what might give rise to concerns about more litigation around this concept. So I was wondering, what do you think about that aspect of the proposal, and how do you think this is going to be the one that we're going to be talking about about the rule? The rule. Do you think this is going to be the aspect of it that we're going to be talking about a lot in the future? What do you think, since you brought it up earlier?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna fight the question a little bit, because it'll be both what's in the rule and what's not in the rule a little bit. Which is to say, I think you're right to say establishing a materiality threshold does not greatly reduce the cost of compliance. Mm-hmm. It does marginally with respect to, lawyering the public disclosures themselves and making sure that they're buttoned up. But the cost internally of establishing whether a particular risk and information is material should happen either way. Mm-hmm. And so establishing the threshold doesn't mean that you don't go through the internal processes of understanding, your emissions, your physical risk imposed to you, the technological and policy changes that may affect your business. So that's all still there. And I do think it creates a bunch of judgment calls. The bigger judgment call that's kind of implicit but left out of the rule, and the part that I saw as like the biggest open question, which I think the SEC is still well within its power to address even without another rule, is how, when those issues are identified as material and disclosed, many of them should have bearing on the financial statements. Mm-hmm. The SEC's draft rule made a direct connection between those two by saying, we would like to understand and that you disclose in footnotes the assumptions and estimates that inform those financial statement numbers, tying back to so it's tying the front and the back end of the financial reporting. That dropped out of the rule. I think the implications are still there. Mm-hmm. So the terminal value of an oil reserve is still affected by your forecasted demand of oil. That's still implicit in that financial statement and still implicit in the Reg SX disclosures, but the SEC hasn't expressly said, we want you to articulate what assumptions you're making about the transition to a net zero economy when you make when you put these numbers down to paper. And I think the SEC, without another rule, could still clarify that, and it'd be really valuable to understand what is expected of companies there, and I hope they do that. But there is this even bigger open question about how to make sense of, you establish something as material, you disclose that there are potential risks to your business plan or to your expectations in the market, and then don't tie it to your financial statement numbers. That the SEC's kind of put on the hook in a way to respond to that, I think, still, if it doesn't want to avoid even greater complications and litigation around not only what is established as material, but what the implications for the company are.
I think one thing just to keep in mind is that the history here a little bit of this topic, in that the SEC in 2010, in response to sort of pressure from the legislature and the like, put out guidance that said you really should be talking about this topic of climate change if and to the extent it is material under our existing framework of disclosure, listing out the various elements where all of them are disclosure requirements that have a materiality qualifier. And the history of that is that the vast majority of companies, that particularly those that were not in carbon intensive industries, did not really include a lot of incremental disclosure about climate change. And when the SEC probed that by asking questions through their comment process in the Division of Corporation Finance, companies came back and said, we concluded that it wasn't material and therefore we didn't disclose it. And so now that we have these adopted rules, to the extent they go into effect, they have the same materiality qualifiers that we have in all of these other pre-existing disclosure items. And so you could certainly conceive of a world where a vast majority of companies that are not in carbon intensive industries will conclude that the greenhouse gas emissions disclosure isn't material, or that the disclosure you just mentioned is not material and therefore isn't required to be disclosed under these new disclosure items. So I think that's the history we can't ignore, I think, in terms of how companies have approached it. And perhaps more guidance from the SEC or more for clarification will be helpful in moving the path toward more disclosure in these areas.
Great. So I wanted to, so I think we have a very good sense of what the SEC is about. I wanted to move on to the California laws now and how they come into the picture. So Dave, you were kind of instrumental in pushing for these laws. So I would love for you to give us the background on that. And it's also one of the way I understand it, at least, and tell me if I'm wrong, California's effort came a little bit as a surprise in the sense that it was a regime that was demanding it at a moment when the SEC had already received a lot of pushback against its proposals. But now we have the scope 3 requirement, for example, in the California legislation. So you started mentioning about how you expect these to interact with companies around the country. So why don't you expand on this a little bit? Tell us what California aim to achieve and whether you think they're going to achieve it.
California bravely goes where no state has gone, regardless of what the federal government is doing. So California enacted 2 laws. One requires greenhouse gas emissions reporting, was authored by Senator Scott Wiener, who represents a district just across the bay. The second, that was SB 253. The second, SB 261, which our center was involved in drafting, was carried by State Senator Henry Stern, who represents a district much further south of here. And both of them work together. The first bill requires Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions reporting. There's a phase-in period for Scope 3. It applies to corporations, both private and public, partnerships that have $1 billion in revenue annually. It reached some 5,000 of the largest private and public companies in the United States. And it's important to note that it's not just limited to companies that are domiciled or incorporated or headquartered in California. The second bill, SB 261, requires basically TCFD or now ISSB aligned reporting biannually. It attaches to companies that have $500,000 more, $500 million or more in annual revenues. That's going to reach 10,000 companies across the United States. And I think that it's fair to say, I mean, there were sizable legislative majorities, and Governor Newsom, announced it and signed it with great fanfare at New York Climate Week, that it represents a majority view in California that it's important to do both greenhouse gas emissions reporting as well as disclosure as to risks companies face from climate change. And it's important to do that really regardless of the vagaries of changes in leadership and policy at the federal level. Now, that's not to say that, and there are more expert and experienced folks on the SEC on this panel than I am, that I'm suggesting that a different administration could immediately wipe out the SEC rule. It takes some time. These are 5-year terms, turnover. You can't immediately undo a regulation that's been appropriately promulgated. But I think the view of the leadership in California was it's important for investors, consumers, vendors, policymakers to have this information, and it's important for our economy and our markets, and so these laws were enacted. Now, the challenge that I alluded to a moment ago and other speakers have alluded to is it's creating different reporting regimes, and that poses some challenges, but SB 261, which is the TCFD or ISSB reporting framework and that California has now legislated. The legislation also provides that if you're submitting reports under other regulatory jurisdictions that are largely in compliance with California's requirements, then those will count. So there's some recognition in California that we want to try to reduce the level of duplication as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. So something that I found very interesting about the California laws and the process for enacting the California laws was that a similar set of bills was before the California legislature about a year ago, and it didn't get through. But then a year later, it did go through. And one of the changes that I noticed, but perhaps you can tell me more, but one of the changes that I noticed, and it kind of touches upon the themes of this panel, is that a lot of large companies in California came out actually in support of this legislation the second time around, whereas and that was mostly large companies from Silicon Valley, other big companies too, whereas the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as a whole was still opposed to it. So I think that gives us an interesting look into kind of the political economy, if you want about the legislation and what companies are looking and how things are looking to different companies for different reasons. And I was wondering if you know more about that, and if any of the panelists would like to comment on how the challenge is different for large companies and small companies.
So I think that's an important point. The bills were introduced separately a couple of years ago, and as is oftentimes the case in the California state legislative process, it takes some time. It takes some education of members. It takes some education of the administration. It takes some education sometimes of the regulatory body, in this case CARB, that's charged with responsibility for issuing regulations for both bills. And so it's not surprising that something as significant as this would not move through both houses in the first year or even the first 2-year session, but would take another session to be reintroduced. I think too that there was there has been over time an increase in voluntary compliance with TCFD or ISSB reporting. There's movement in Europe. There was a change, obviously in federal administration and more direction to independent federal regulatory agencies that they ought to be upping their game with regard to climate risk, including the SEC taking up its role. And I think all of that added some momentum. I think you're absolutely correct that the tech sector got behind the bills. It wasn't just the tech sector, though. It was others that have been engaging since 2017 in the TCFD framework voluntarily, and the ISB framework more recently. And so there's been a lot of voluntary compliance, I think, by companies that are significant players here. The California Chamber of Commerce tends to oppose most legislation that requires new obligations on businesses in California. It's not surprising that they would oppose this. They were particularly vehement in their opposition. With all respect, I've been subject to that opposition when I served in the legislature. But I think they had a split in their membership. But notwithstanding that, they continued to oppose. And some of that may have been driven by, as you allude to, forces within the California Chamber that are more representative of small business that were very worried about the implications of these laws for them. So, but I think a real coalition emerged ultimately to get both bills over the finish line.
Yes, please go ahead, Emily. I was planning to ask you, and also if you can give us an insight on how your advice to companies changes given the California laws.
Sure. Just to follow on those excellent points, I personally think that California, not unlike EU lawmakers, over time felt that they had developed enough evidence that the markets are capable of adjusting behavior with respect to these issues, and that enough businesses that were meaningful for purposes of passing these laws, because they would be in scope, right, had themselves recognized and developed a business case around the fact that, in this case climate, but with respect to other issues too, human rights, environmental sustainability, that there is both an intrinsic value and a business value to looking at them, right? You can lower your business risks and avoid costs if you look at these, right, over time. Fundamental as that, right? Much more complicated fundamental as that. I think it's also important to recognize that, California, always the first mover, right? Modern slavery, heavy emitters, other areas. But much like the EU, we're now seeing the California effect play out, right? Other US states are, although in the early stages, there are proposed measures that look quite a lot like 253, 261, I believe. There's also, we shouldn't forget, AB 1305, right? Assemblyman Gabriel's voluntary carbon market disclosures law, which is, like the other measures, potentially subject to further clarification by means of cleanup legislation. So dynamic space. To answer your question to me, Stavros, increasingly I describe my practice as, towards helping companies ask and answer, questions relating to compliance. It really boils down to three very separate but at the same time interrelated questions. One, what applies to me, both directly but sometimes more importantly indirectly, because it's important to remember that a lot of companies, smaller companies, are sucked up into these frameworks, whatever it is we're talking about, by virtue of their place in other companies' supply chains or value chains. And there may be real revenue at risk to the extent companies aren't prepared for that possibility, right? I'll need to present my customer with data to facilitate their, in California's case, Scope 3 emissions disclosure requirements. The second question is one of regulatory reconciliation. Given what applies to me and on what timescales, what are the steps and preparation I need to engage in now to help me prepare to meet and satisfy multiple end purposes where there is some commonality, but also, nuances as a result of, different legal regimes. And, in the case of SEC versus California, a real delta in compliance requirements, right? And then the third question is one of programmatic uplift, right? given what applies to me, what I need to produce and when, what scenario analysis do I need to be engaging in now? With what stakeholders do I need to be engaging with now, right? What sort of, benchmarking in relation to my peers, right? Do I need to be engaging in now? And ultimately, what, monitoring, data collection, aggregation, data I don't have that I need to obtain in a disclosable format, and disclosure will I need to provide that is ultimately, disclosed in a manner that is value add to my business, including because of avoided costs. How do I get there, right, based on where I am today? So it's a very rich and diverse, field. We don't have time to get into double materiality versus financial materiality, right? EU double, inbound, outbound. Here in the United States, we're still, looking at financial purely. And I think there are real, perhaps, problems to be anticipated for companies that are in scope of the SEC rule when trying to apply those traditional financial materiality, concepts to potentialities that may not be, realized over the short term, and hence where causation may be difficult to establish. But that's for another day. Thanks.
So I wanted to come next to the European regime, and all of you, kind of in your introductory remarks about the SEC or about California, we're all about, look at what Europe is doing. So let's look at what Europe is doing. So one of the kind of fascinating aspects of the European regime, even for, should I say, a former European or a current European like me, is kind of how comprehensive it is compared to the US regime. So in the US, we're mostly focused on disclosure at the moment, and this is why we've heard a lot about the CSRD in previous conversations. But in Europe, it's not just disclosure by issuers. It's also, there's a whole set of regulations about how asset managers are going to look at information provided by issuers in order to kind of justify whether they can be called an ESG fund or an ESG investment, known as the taxonomy regulation. There's a bunch of other directives that are coming into force very soon. There's the biodiversity directive. So it's a broader set, much more comprehensive regime. So is this, now we heard from the previous panel that this kind of, on the one hand, it's more items to disclose. On the other hand, it might give more guidance to people about what they need to disclose or not and how to assess things. So my first question would be, how do you think, so why do you advise your clients as to the European regime? How closely do they need to think about it, and what are the lines that they need to be aware of? Do you want to get started, Emily, or I saw you? Yeah. I saw you very passionate.
Oh. Thanks, Stavros. Obviously it'll depend on whether you're in scope, but
Yeah.
Assuming you are, and let's just broadly assume that you are subject to CSRD, potentially CSDDD, SFDRs, obviously another behemoth. But perhaps actually, Stavros, to back up, to be honest with you, we're always evaluating and evolving our own taxonomies for how we help clients understand these regimes. And my latest favorite articulation is we're increasingly seeing sort of three key varietals, key species or genuses, or whatever the appropriate term might be here. One, in the EU, one is the company-specific laws and regs, disclosure and or due diligence requirements that essentially focus on corporate activity and apply based on where companies are headquartered or where they operate, and based on meeting certain thresholds having to do with number of employees and turnover or balance sheet. And then a second key varietal, which we also see a lot of in the United States, this is actually the area where the US has and continues to demonstrate real leadership, is in laws that focus instead on the transmission of goods, inputs, financial flows, right? And they will apply based on goods, inputs, et cetera, crossing the regulating entities' borders. And then the third varietal is sort of the other, so carbon tax, right, CBAM, et cetera. So golly, the greatest risk for global business used to be described as the pace of change in this context. I think these days it's the diversity of requirements and the comprehensiveness of the actions that are required of them. And so sort of back to my trifecta, right? What applies? How do I reconcile it? And then what will get me there? That's how we increasingly approach it. Bringing it back to SEC in California, assuming you are in scope of both and EU, my anticipation, and noting that both SEC and California are subject to extensive legal actions, not to mention funding questions, I think my anticipation is that many companies will look to the EU rules as establishing the legal baseline, which will drive their compliance efforts, given that they are more onerous, adopt a more capacious materiality standard, and then leverage those efforts, driving compliance with those rules to satisfy measures in the US, which are more modest. Thanks.
Ilmi?
I want to take a step back because we really love to compare the SEC rule and the European rule, the rules, and I think it is really important. And then we get up to talk about double materiality and single materiality. I think it is important to go back to the fundamentals. They're very fundamental differences to understand in what they're trying to do, and I think it's important for registrants and investors to understand this as well. And they track to legislative versus regulatory approaches. I'm pretty capitalist. I believe that efficient
Bold
capital
statement.
allocation, efficient capital allocation is a value and a public good, and that allowing private parties to determine how to allocate financial capital creates in the aggregate more wealth for society, and that's good. I'm not slavish to that norm. I think, as Amory Lovins once put it, markets make excellent servants but terrible masters, and even worse, religions. And I think that's a really good principle. But there's two purposes going on. Rather than lauding the European approach and denigrating the U.S. approach, even if I think the SEC's rule itself falls short. When you are charged with the mandate of ensuring the markets allocate capital efficiently, there is still a major climate problem, which is that we're in a discontinuity of physical transformation of the climate and a discontinuity in that we're in structural transformation of the economy in a decarbonizing world. And under that principle, we need to have the market have the right signals where investors can understand that discontinuity and make good capital allocations, or there's an enormous amount of value destruction that comes with the misallocation of capital. I would have loved for the SEC rule to nail that rule to ensure that investors have that information, and there's tremendous value within the SEC's mandate in delivering that. And I think one of the California rules, the one that tracks the ISSB disclosure, does that well, because that's what is the underpinning of the ISSB disclosure framework. And if you want details on that history and value, you have the head of SASB, which is still the ISSB standard effectively in the room, Janine. And I think that value is really important. And it is a separate principle where legislatures have decided that they would like to discipline the market, not only to allow private parties to determine the allocation of capital, but to have government say, we actually want to make sure that these parties are beginning to allocate capital in a particular way, to create some rules around that. And I actually think that's really what the Europeans are trying to nip around the edges, which is to change the rules of the markets. So if you really want to be forward-looking, some economies are considering the limits of allowing private parties to determine financial capital allocation. That's what transition plans do. They say, look, you need a plan where effectively, if you're going to follow it, the company has to allocate its balance sheet in particular ways to deliver that plan. That's pretty prescriptive. And so I don't think this is, I think we could make these compatible by understanding these two principles and how they relate. I don't think it means that every regime has to look identical. I think it's kind of understanding what each thing does. And I don't think we have to look at the European model as the only approach. I would love it if the US capital markets, we really felt like the signal of the transition to a net zero economy and the signal of the physical impacts of climate change were fully internalized by investors, and they had all the information they needed to do that. And I think we were like, they took an incremental step there with the SEC rule, but I'm still not confident that that's going to be fully priced into the market under the SEC's mandate. So I don't want to kind of push them too close together because I think they serve different purposes.
Okay, but Ilmi, I can tell that you've been hanging out with academics for the last couple of years because you've set it up perfectly for me to ask the question that I wanted to ask next, which is like this kind of divide that you're describing between the European and the US regime on climate. It's just not only on climate. Very often we see or we describe US approaches as leaning more heavily on the market to kind of come up with its own ideas about how to solve problems. And Dave kind of hinted to that when he said that the California legislature was feeling confident that the market had already kind of gotten to that point, and that's why they passed the mandatory disclosure rules. On the other hand, what we see in Europe is not just the laws, but also kind of the institutional infrastructure that deals more with enforcement. So there is EFRAG, a body that actually is set up to provide guidance to companies about how to disclose. There's ongoing discussion about, okay, this is how you frame this disclosure, public notice and comment processes. It's a much more kind of advanced regime that makes one wonder, is this necessary? Is this what climate disclosure needs? Tim mentioned in the earlier panel that if Chevron deference is repealed, we're going to have weaker regulators in the US right at the moment when we need them. So I had the question, is this what we really need? And Ilmi, yes, you get to answer first, but I wanted to also hear Dave Jones's view and everybody's view, actually, who wanted to jump in.
I would be remiss. You're never going to get me on a panel without bringing up the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay.
And so here's where this ties in. It's really important. I don't think that it's sort of a better and worse approach. I think these are different approaches. And what I mean is, I do think we're entering an era in which we understand that the role of government is to shape and steer the market, and that creates societal good. And so it's sort of a horses for courses argument. In the US model, if we get it right, and we're kind of fumbling our way there, and I think the SEC rule looks like kind of fumbling our way, the final rule, you have lots of signals from government as to the direction of the economy. You have the largest climate legislation in the history of the world under the Inflation Reduction Act, somewhere between $400 billion and $1.2 trillion of public spending and commensurate private capital allocation that's shaped by that. That's pretty big. A bunch of enforcement rules that will follow on the tail of that because it buys down the cost of those regulatory regimes. And then in the capital markets regulation, we should have rules that make sure that when investors make capital allocation decisions, they fully understand that policy and technology and the economy looks very different in a $100 a kilowatt hour battery world than today. That is a different approach than using the rules of the market as a way of steering capital, which is the approach that Europe is exploring and taking. And I'm not saying that they both can work, but I wouldn't treat the European approach of sort of dual materiality in the capital markets and saying any registrant has to have a transition plan is inherently better. It's a different concept.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make some gross generalizations, but I think that the European political economy is different than the United States, and you have a greater degree of centralization of decision-making within nation states, and as balkanized as it is, even within the EU, and you have regulatory apparatus or sort of private association apparatus that you've alluded to that are helping to guide the market and guide regulators and policymakers. And there's certainly greater consensus within European private sector leadership in alignment with their national leaders about the nature of the climate crisis and the need to begin doing something about it and begin to reallocate capital accordingly. Here we have a very balkanized system of governance, a balkanized political economy. We have a federal system. And I think Ilmi's actually, is absolutely spot on in terms of, I don't know that we need to have what the Europeans have to get us to where we need to go. And frankly, we don't have, and we're not going to have what they have because of the nature of our political system here. But even as fragmented as it is, I mean, for example, we've got 50 states and 6 territories that each have their own insurance regulator, right? And you can imagine how excited back in, I don't know, 2016, 2015, 2011, when I started saying, hey, we got to start surveying insurance companies with regard to climate risk, how excited the other 55 were about that. But they're there now, right? Took some time, but the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which is the credentialing body for insurance regulation, notwithstanding having 50 states and 6 territories as representatives, now is actually undertaking a survey of insurance companies that uses the TCFD framework. So you can get there. It's just, I think it's going to take longer here. We have to deal with the fact that there's greater balkanization. But to Ilmi's point, I think we'll get there. I think it's going to be longer, and I also think that we're going to rely potentially more on the private sector itself driving some of this because we have this balkanized political and regulatory structure here.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to kind of, now that we've seen kind of the whole regime, I wanted to come back to some of the issues that we discussed earlier. So, and one, and in particular, the anti-ESG backlash. There was a discussion of green hashing earlier and kind of the effect that this has on companies' disclosures, where the idea is that companies do things but perhaps are kind of not very open or about it. So I was wondering, how do you think this is going to affect disclosure by companies in the future? What do they need to have in mind? Or have you seen any examples of this affecting disclosures that the clients you're advising are planning to make? Yep.
Can I start for a second? I think it's important to distinguish between so-called anti-ESG legislation that's been enacted at the state level that's basically, frankly, a gun pointed at the head of the state procurement process and the state pension funds and states' decision-making about how to use their own money versus anti-ESG legislation that seeks to regulate the broader market, so state licensed banks, state licensed insurance companies. And there has been anti-ESG legislation passed in a number of states on the former side. There have been a bunch of studies that indicate that as a result of that, those entities, whether it's state pension funds or state teachers' pension funds or the state treasuries that are engaged in procurement, are actually going to lose out because of the prohibitions they're putting on contracting with entities that consider risks you would want them to consider. But there's been less success in passing state legislation that actually regulates external markets. And Texas is a great example, right? Someone got the bright idea to introduce a bill in the Texas legislature that would prevent Texas insurance companies from considering environmental risks. Well, guess who opposed that? The Texas insurance industry. And they were able to water that bill down to basically nothing, right? In Indiana, there was a bill that would have regulated state chartered banks that would have prevented them from considering ESG. Guess who rose up against that? The State Banking Association in Indiana. So I think there's a distinction there. I think it's a problem, the laws that have been enacted, and I think it's gonna act as a drag on progress in this area, but I don't think it's ultimately fatal. And I think that the very industries themselves that might be regulated by the second universe of anti-ESG bills have been fairly successful in making sure those don't get enacted at the state level.
Any examples from? No.
I have views, but I've talked a lot, so I'll go last.
I have been described as perhaps optimistic by my co-panelists, but I would love to remind the audience that greenwashing is actually one of the key fulcrums for the original anti-ESG movement, right? Which, really sort of leapt to the fore in 2021 with Texas. And I harbor a modicum of perhaps unfounded optimism that there might be some degree of consensus at some stage with respect to certain issues, and that this may be one of them, right? Exerting greater controls on, what companies, are prepared to, demonstrate as, to shore up what they've said. We followed the anti-ESG movement and the pro-ESG movement very closely, developed a state-by-state tracker. Every month, here are the laws, the proposals, the bills, their fate, but also, other pro and anti-ESG initiatives, right? State AG, litigation, letters, et cetera. It's been a huge counterweight and force. My own perception is that this year you've seen some of the oomph go out of some of the measures, perhaps as a result of black eyes that certain lawmakers that really push, that thesis endured last year. Certainly some outliers. The effect of the ultimate election later this year, but also congressional elections, state AG elections, et cetera. It's all playing a part. I think, climate change and DEI have been, the real issues that have been the focus of many of the anti-ESG measures. We've seen a lot of companies which, disclose against these issues, really try to seek to preserve and maintain relationships, not engaging where they don't have to, right? Being perhaps more judicious and thoughtful this year as to what they do say, understanding that there are different ways to ultimately say the same thing while not scaling back on certain programs. But ultimately, depending on how, political developments develop, it may be increasingly hard for some, not to engage and take certain stands. So that's what I'd say. It's a real force, but it's one of many. And I think for many clients we counsel on these issues, it really comes down to a fundamental ethos with which they approach these issues, right? Do they see this over the long term, as, more than through a lens of the historically disfavored compliance mindset and more along the lines of, real, a point of competition, right? To engage here where they might not have before. But a lot remains to be seen.
Dave, you want to go next? And then
I'll just, on sort of in terms of backlash, I'll just say on the SEC rulemaking, if you're dissatisfied with how the commission ultimately came out with that rulemaking, you should gird yourself for what the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals might do in considering that. And it's interesting to me, it just by random chance ended up in the Eighth Circuit, which is a conservative-leaning circuit, but for many years, the real arbiter of the administrative state was the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which at least had sort of the depth of jurisdiction over agency action. So, I think it will be interesting. The SEC sometimes may not be the best rulemaker, but I'm pretty sure that federal judges are very bad at rulemaking from my experience.
I think there's a tendency when we talk about anti-ESG to focus on it as a legislative agenda and a policy agenda, and I don't think it is, and I don't think it serves anyone to think of it in terms of as if it were a policy agenda. There is really no one out there that is saying, we think as a matter of sort of technical, there's a technical issue where the information that investors are getting with respect to non-financial information is making them make worse decisions, and we think it's bad for capital market formation, blah, blah, blah. There's just no one that thinks that. This is a political agenda, and it's valuable to name it as such for the following reason. The reason we're seeing some attenuation is because it's failed to get political traction. As much as that you have treasurers and AGs that have other political aspirations, some of which are elected, but also some of which have aspirations to become other types of elected officials, seeing this as an opportunity to draw the capital markets into a culture war. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't have political traction and political salience, it attenuates. The flip side is also true, and I think we should be very careful here, which is that if it gains political salience, not creative enough in our thinking of the mayhem that can be done to the capital markets and the rules of the capital markets in the name of attacking ESG. We could have the entire function of supervision of financial institutions and the functioning of the capital markets use anti-ESG as a way of directing capital in particular ways. I mean, you could have total mayhem if it gains political salience. So really the question always to be asking in the background isn't like how tuned a particular legislative agenda is to X and Y, but how much political salience does this particular theme have? And I think the ultimate aim of it, in my view, is that what the proponents want to make happen, I don't think it's sort of equally E and S and G. I think what the aim of it is, I think Ira is again in the dead center of it, which is what its proponents want is that when a investor makes a decision to invest in clean energy, you can attack them that was politically and not financially motivated. Where it leads is the idea that sort of ipso facto making a good decision for a clean energy investment can be treated as a demonstration of a set of values and not a good financial decision, and that you can attack them on that and make them retreat out of those markets. And I think that that's the purpose of it, and we need to kind of like really get what it's trying to do when we know that, you know, there's a lot of capital flowing into the clean energy economy because it's really good financial decision making. And so it's to cause a retreat of that, and we have to kind of keep that in mind and understand what it's doing and not sort of treat it so technocratically as a set of like policy tools where we just have sort of a lively policy debate about how best to kind of integrate non-financial information in the market, because I don't think that's really what's going on.
But if that's your understanding, Elmi, what do you think is going to happen after November if we have a Republican win?
So I think this is what I mean. If you have a shift in the politics, in political power, you could have a shift that is one where you have even greater chilling effects, but no actual legislative or policy change. Sort of depends on who. And my brother and I in Climate Technology Group did for a client a scenario analysis of these different scenarios. We're in muddling through right now, which is that there's this kind of bad chilling effect. It affects anything that has a reputational risk benefit because that calculus has changed. But if you have a real business case for something sustainable, that's still kind of happening. You just don't talk about it. Just allowing that to fester allows people to creatively identify new arguments that may give it political salience, and we may tip into what we call the troubles, which is that you still don't have this aggressively used as a tool to attack clean energy investments, but you have a retreat from those investments because you don't want to be seen as creating risk. But the real dangerous scenario is if you have, like, say, a trifecta of right-wing political power, that you start saying, you know, your failure to invest in fossil fuels reflects your secret values and you're creating financial instability or making bad capital allocation. I mean, really creative, wacky shit that I really think we should be cognizant of. And that is a real danger, like using the apparatus of financial regulation and capital markets regulation as a way of penalizing clean energy investment and good financial decisions to protect incumbent interests. And so it's totally I mean, I'm not going to predict the election, but I'll say understanding the risk of anti-ESG is entirely calibrated to that political shift and not to some sort of underlying dynamic.
We are at time, but one more minute.
Only, your question is what happens if there's a change in administration and Trump gets elected? Only bad things.
Okay.
And he'll be better at doing them. Because last time he didn't know what he was doing and he caused a lot of damage. This time there's a plan. They're imposing loyalty oaths on people that want to be in the administration, and it'll take some time, right? They can't just clear out every federal regulatory agency overnight. There are terms. There's still some independent status, but only bad things.
With some exceptions, however, IRA you mentioned, right? There is no incentive for a Trump administration to repeal that, given where the majority of the benefits are realized, right? Red states. That holds true of other sustainability measures too, right? UFLPA, right, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and as a response to China. I am not disagreeing, but I'm saying that there may be, right? I also think, I just wanted to highlight Larry Fink's annual letter to CEOs dropped a couple days ago. Very interesting to see the modulation and messaging, right? It is energy pragmatism, right? It's decarbonization meets energy security. That's a far cry from sort of, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, last year. And I am seeing in my practice sort of a shift towards that, conception, right? Natural gas as a cleaner, variant than coal, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. So we're at lunch. Clearly, we could be discussing this endlessly, but we'll stop and then we'll continue with the politicization panel later on. Thank you very much.